Dear students, I'm delighted to welcome you again to this presentation on business continuity management. This is part 3 of the 5 series presentations on the chapter 4, which is business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning. Let's go further and understand what this topic is all about. Let's look at the learning objectives of this chapter. We know we already covered what is business continuity planning. We looked at the distinction between business continuity planning and business continuity plan and disaster recovery plan. Now, these 3 key aspects is what we looked at. Now, in this presentation, we are primarily going to focus on the key aspects of the business continuity plan. Part 4 and 5 will look at the backup and disaster recovery planning and also how to audit the business continuity plan. Some of the aspects which are covered in earlier presentations, I'm not going to get into detail. I'll be skipping and I'll giving just an overview of this particular presentation. So these are the aspects I'll be covering in this presentation. What is the business BCM strategy process? We said BCM in distinction with BCP is focused on the management of BCP at a strategy level, which means we are looking at the enterprise level, how business continuity planning is going to be implemented, and that's what is called as BCM. We look at the strategy process. We also looked at we'll also look at how BCM could be developed in terms of development and the implementation process. We'll also look at the testing and maintenance phase and also the training phase process which is required for BCM. Now you find a lot of similarity between DRP, BCP and BCM, but you need to remember that the BCM is at a macro level, BCP is a subset of BCM, and the DRP is a subset of a business continuity plan. Let's have a quick overview of what is business continuity plan, which we already discussed. We know business continuity plan is a statement of the actions to be taken, the resources to be used, the procedures to be followed before, during, and after a disaster. So the primary focus is to ensure that you've got a business plan where the goal is to minimize the loss to the enterprise in spite of a disaster. So the primary focus of preparing a business continuity plan is to ensure that you're able to envisage different type of situations and prepare a business plan which ensures that the business is continued despite disruptions. Now, the BCP plan or document or the BCP manual will help the organization to build the capacity or the capability to maintain the continuity of critical operations across the business enterprise. These are the key aspects you need to remember when you look at the business continuity planning. This presentation is primarily on BCM. Now, we already emphasized so many times BCM refers to BCP, it includes BCP, and then you have DRP, which means when you're developing a BCM also, it's important that you need to have the disaster recovery procedures, and DRP, you know, is primarily pertaining to the technology, that to recover the technology is required for the business. Let's understand what are the disaster recovery procedures which are to be followed. So the disaster recovery procedures primarily focus on temporary restoration of the computing and the network operations within the defined timeframes. Now, the defined time frame is based on the business continuity policy, which has been already formulated. So, DRP, as I said, focus on the technological aspects of the BCP. Now, DRP is a crucial component of the enterprise risk management. When you look at, if you remember, we talked about the enterprise risk management earlier. And when you're doing disaster recovery planning, you need to consider what could the impact for various types of operations, especially the critical operations. And the objective is to continue the operations. If you look at the definition of disaster recovery, it is a science of mitigating the impact of disasters, no matter what causes them. I think this should summarize the discussion about what is disaster recovery and the distinction between disaster recovery and business continuity planning and business continuity management. Why does an organization require a business continuity planning or disaster recovery? Now, this clearly demonstrates what we need to know. We already discussed this in detail, so I'll not get into this aspect in more detail. So you know the IT systems are expanding in complexity and there's a lot of reliance on information technology, and this gives rise to new type of risks. So there is a big possibility that the real damage to a business. Now the threat which was earlier mostly focused on the internal threats, now there is also a threat not only from the external environment, and this could be from the external world, not necessarily from a natural factor, but also from the external factors such as hackers, because anybody who anywhere in the world can access the information if it is not properly protected. That itself gives rise to new risks. So when you're doing a risk assessment, you want to look at different types of risk scenarios and accordingly plan for this. Now let's look at a quick idea of what is BCP and what a BCP does. This we already discussed. The key point I wanted to remember that BCP is an ongoing process. It's not a project, which means you need to ensure that BCP is updated on a regular basis. Now, what does the BCP do? How does it get activated? When the disaster is declared, it activates the pre-approved policies and authorities so that the organization can continue the operations with the least possible cost to the organization. What is a disaster? We already seen this. A sudden unplanned calamitous event that interrupts an ability to continue the operations. So which means it stops the organization, and we're looking at the critical and essential functions which can be impacted. What could be the cause of disaster condition? We already discussed this earlier. It could be the natural disasters, it could be the flood, cyclones, fires, etc. There could also be utilities which could be impacted. Because the failure of the utilities, you may have a disaster. But there could also be human causes. This gives you a list of the disaster conditions. When you're preparing a business impact analysis, you'll envisage the different types of disaster scenarios. You'll consider the different type of threats and decide how you're going to mitigate these threats. Let's look at what are the different causes of disaster condition. There could be equipment failure, there could be human errors, there could be contamination. What are the impact of the disasters? If you look at from the financial health, there could be loss of revenue. If you look at from the service level of customer's attitude, if you look at from the human resources, this is from the point of the dependence on information technology. And there are also liabilities for not providing the services as per the contract. What is the management perception of BCP? The general belief is that the BCP should be installed quickly at the minimal cost. And this should be able to minimize the cost and disruption to the organization. It should be a workable plan and which ensures quality deliverables. And there has to be leadership who is able to provide direction on what is going to be done for different types of disaster scenarios. You also need to train the people so that they are aware and they respond to a disaster with the right action as planned earlier. And the most important aspect of BCP is that it should be current and updated on a regular basis. Let's look at the phases pertaining to business continuity plan. You have to first of all organize the risk assessment team. Based on that, they conduct a risk assessment. You do the risk scoping and prioritization in terms of what are the different types of events which can happen, what is the impact, and you prioritize the events. Based on that, you develop different types of scenarios, threat scenarios or risk scenarios based on the vulnerabilities. You plan, once you got those scenarios, you develop the plans. You identify what are the event triggers, what could trigger the disaster, how the BCP is to be activated. You test the plans and you train on the plans by giving the required type of training for the staff. And then you get to the execution, which is the implementation. When the trigger event occurs, what you need to do is execute the plan. Now, like they say, the challenge is when the road hits the rubber. So you may have a lot of documented plans, but it's important that the training is properly given so the staff can actually implement and execute the plan as per the plan, and you're able to recover. So the recovery would start when the event ends, or you may start activating the recovery plan and start operating from the alternate site as required. Now let's come to the important aspect, which is the BCM. What is the strategy process for the BCM? So you need to establish the procedures for backing the files and applications. You need to establish the contracts and agreements, because remember, we are looking at BCM from the management perspective, from the enterprise perspective. You also need to look at the different types of service contracts which could be there. You need to renegotiate the contract, because in the case of business continuity plan, the level of service has to be much higher compared to the normal level of service, the normal time taken to provide the service. You may also have to purchase additional equipment or procure additional resources as required to ensure that you're able to build in the redundant capability and you're able to provide the services. Now let's look at further. So when you look at the strategy process, you may decide that some of the activities are going to be non-critical. Now these may also be included the business continuity plan, but if they're going to impact the critical activity, you'll also decide what should be the strategy to be adopted, and this should consider the implementation of what are the measures or the controls you need to have to reduce the likelihood of the events. And you can also look at the reduce the potential impact of these events. And you're looking at the resilience and the mitigation measures for both critical and non-critical activities as relevant. Let's look at how do you develop and implement a business continuity management. So you need to have an exclusive organization structure. You need to have an incident management team which is able to respond to the incident and act accordingly as required. You should also have the required organization structure which should confirm the impact of the incident. Then we should be able to control the situation, control the incident, and also communicate the various stakeholders. You may also have to coordinate the response for the type of incidents which happen. If you look at the incident management plan, you need to manage the initial phase of an incident, which is going to be very critical. The top management support has to be provided by ensuring that you have the right budgets so that you can invest as required based on the needs of the organization. It has to be flexible, feasible, and relevant. Now, the incident plan has to be implementable, which means the users who are at multiple levels of the organization should be able to understand and implement this. And this becomes the basis on which you're going to provide or consider all the possible issues in terms of the different types of incidents and the impact for the business. Now let's look at the business critical plan. What is the business critical plan? It's invoked to support the critical activities. The recovery strategies may be looking at from the point of business and technology. We also discussed this clearly, that when you look at business, you look at business critical plan, technology focus more on the disaster recovery. When you look at the business, you could be look at logistics, accounting, and various other processes which are required. And when you look at technology, you look at technical, you look at various aspects of the technology. Now let's look at the BCM testing and maintenance process. There's no purpose but served by having a BCM if it is not workable. And you'll not know whether it's workable unless it's properly tested. And it's not enough if you have a business critical plan or a BCM which is prepared at some particular point of time. You also need to update this on a regular basis so that it reflects the current scenario, the current reality, the current situation of the enterprise. So when you're doing the testing and the maintenance, and after that you know to review the BCM arrangements, based on that you need to update. So what does testing involve and how is testing done? Let's have a quick walkthrough of this, because this is also some of the areas where you may have questions. What does the BCP testing program involve? The testing of the different aspects of the enterprise which could be impacted by the disaster. That could be pertaining to the technology, could be pertaining to the logistics, the administrative procedures, or also the operational systems. These are the different aspects which need to be tested, because each of them are interdependent and they impact the enterprise ability to recover from a disaster and continue to provide the services at the critical required level as envisaged. Now, when you look at the BCM arrangements which have to be made, you also need to look at the infrastructure requirements. Infrastructure in terms of the roles, responsibilities, and the incident management locations and the work area. The technology, which is the key enabler for any enterprise, also has to be considered, because you need to look at how you can operate from that particular site, or you can also operate from an off-site. Let's look at the testing. So what is involved in testing? You're actually practicing in advance before the disaster occurs. What is the enterprise ability to recover from an incident? You are verifying and validating whether the BCP has considered all the aspects, whether it has considered all the critical activities and their dependencies and priorities. Now just remember this word, we are looking at activities, their dependence and priorities. Next, you're looking at the assumptions which have been made in the business continuity plan. For example, you need a particular level of server to be able to provide a service. You may decide that you need so many number of people to provide a particular service. You have made certain assumptions, but when you get a disaster, you may find these are not able to meet the requirements. So you question the assumptions, validate by actually testing the business BCM. This also provides a confidence to the exercise participants that they can operate in the case of a disaster. A few more aspects pertaining to business continuity testing. You need to raise the awareness about the business continuity plan throughout the enterprise by publicizing the exercise so that everybody is involved. Or else it will happen like when there is a fire drill, you find the employees still continue to work thinking that there's nothing has happened. Whereas when there's a fire drill, we know there's an emergency, there's a fire, and all the employees are supposed to be evacuated in an orderly manner based on the priority which has been set up. And there is a clear responsibility assigned for each of the floors, for each of the rooms in terms of who is going to evacuate all the personnel and who will be last to evacuate that particular premise. So you also validate the effectiveness and efficiency, the timeliness of the restoration of critical activities. Which means fundamentally when you look at testing here, we know clearly what is supposed to work, how it's supposed to work. We want to verify and validate whether it actually works. This is what is important. So fundamentally, you're looking at in testing what is supposed to work and whether it actually works as envisaged, and you identify the deficiencies or the weaknesses in the systems as it happens, and based on that you suggest improvements which have to be brought about. So it also helps in demonstrating the competencies of the teams which are being assigned the responsibilities, which are and also the alternatives which have to be put in place. So why do you need to perform BCP tests? To ensure the recovery procedures which are planned are complete and workable, to evaluate the competence of the personnel in the recovery procedures. You also want to ensure that the business processes, system, personnel, etc. are available for the purpose of recovery, for the purpose of continuing the business operations. A few more points. You also may have manual recovery procedures which have to be adopted. So you'll have to consider all these aspects are also tested and they are current. The success or failure of the business continuity plan depends on how well the staff have been trained. So you need to test whether the employees can operate, have learned what is to be done in the case of disaster, and the BCP test will be able to demonstrate whether the employees know what is to be done. So you look at the effectiveness pertaining to the training when you test the BCP plan or the BCM. Now let's look at implementation of the BCP test. How do you perform or implement the BCP tests? This is similar to any other test. You define what is the purpose of the approach for doing the test. You identify the test teams who are going to be performing the particular test. You structure the test by putting a systematic approach and deciding how the test is going to be done. You conduct the test, and after conducting the test, you look at the result, analyze them, and decide whether they actually met the criteria and what are the weaknesses of the test. And based on the test results, you need to modify or update the plans as appropriate. So fundamentally, the objective of testing is to ensure that you are able to update the test, update the business continuity plan based on the results of the test. So it means you're looking at when you test whether it meets the requirements of the enterprise as documented in the business continuity plan. Let's look at the testing process. The first is to set the objectives. What is that you want to achieve by performing the test? Next, to define the boundaries. It's not possible to simulate all the situations, so you need to define what is practically possible to test. So you have different types of scenarios which can happen, and you also define the test criteria. What are the criteria based on which you're going to test? For example, you want to test whether this particular critical business process which is to be performed fails because of failure of a particular aspect of technology. So in that case, you want to test whether the critical business process of servicing the customers at a particular level, whether this is being done. So that becomes the criteria which you want to validate. So you also make assumptions, you validate the assumptions, you test the prerequisites which are required for running the business continuity plan. You'll also have a briefing session when you perform the test, and you'll also do a debriefing briefing session after the test has been conducted. You prepare detailed checklists for various sort of tests to be performed, because it gives you step by step what is to be done by whom, and you analyze the results. And you also have, as I said, the debriefing session to learn, to document what has been learned, and to see that this learning is carried forward, and to also update the plan. So what is involved in testing the BCP? You verify the completeness, the precision of the BCP in terms of meeting the requirement. You evaluate the performance of the personnel who are involved, who are part of the BCP teams. So look at what the BCP teams were there and what is the impact. It's not the impact, we're looking at whether they're able to deliver what is required to deliver as per the test objectives. You also apprise the training and awareness requirements, whether the employees have been properly trained. And you also look at the non-BCP team members who also have a role to play, what are the roles they're supposed to perform, and whether they meet the requirements. You evaluate the coordination, because quite often when the disaster, there's a need for coordination between the different BCP team members and also the external vendors and the suppliers. So you need to check whether all this coordination happens. For example, there is a failure of a system, So in that case, the vendor is supposed to provide the system. The supplier is supposed to supply the usables or the utilities for running that particular system, and all these three have to be coordinated. It measures the ability and the capability or the capacity of the backup site. For example, you need to restore operations from backup site, whether you're able to restore the operations, continuous business operations. You also look at what are the vital records which are required for running the business, whether you're able to retrieve. For example, you may have a backup which is kept in an offsite, and the backup is supposed to be working by restoring it. And you find when you do a BCP test, you find that this BCP backup which you got is not restorable at all. So you also check the restorability, which means the capability, or you assumed to restore the backup, you need a particular system, and you find the system is not capable of taking that particular load and performing as per the required level of operations. So you need to look at the overall performance of the operational and the IS processing activities. These are the key aspects which need to be tested in the case of a BCP. As I said, the BCP testing is one of the key areas where you have questions. So what is important to know is once you know the logic of what is BCP, why is BCP required, how is BCP done, and when you look at it from an internal testing perspective, the management is actually verifying and validating whether the BCP works as per the plan. This is what is the primary objective of the BCP. Now let's look at the maintenance, which is one of the critical aspects of BCM, because if the maintenance is not done, which means the plan is not updated and kept current, which means if the plan is not current, so you find the BCP plan, what the organization has got, may be completely useless. So what does the BCP maintenance process demonstrate? It demonstrates that you have document evidence of proactively managing and governing the enterprise BCP. There are key people who need to be involved in implementing the BCP strategy, and they need to be trained and they're competent to run the BCM. And you also monitor the BCM risk faced by the enterprise. You also need to look at what are the material changes which have happened to the enterprise. This could be in terms of the various operational and the technology aspects. So it could be the technology platform which is being used within the enterprise. It could be the resources which are being used in terms of the people who are going to be involved. It could be the management procedures. It could be the business process. Any aspect of the business process which has to be continued, which is depend on the resources, you need to consider whether these have been updated as per the changes which have happened. Quite often the question asked is, what is the periodicity at which the BCP has to be or the BCM has to be updated? You need to remember that there should be of two types. One, there is a regular BCPM changes, which is done on a regular basis. For example, every year it could be done. And similarly, whenever there is any change which has a major impact, that change has to be done immediately. For example, let's say the business process has been changed because there's a new line of business which has been operated, and in that case, immediately as soon as the new line of business is done, you have to update the business continuity plan. Or let's say the company has changed over to your new technology platform. So in that case also, you need to ensure that the business continuity plan is updated, the BCM is updated. So any change is going to have significant impact, you need to change. Why do you need to change? Because the change will demonstrate whether the plan has been updated and the new resources, everything has been planned as per the new setup and the infrastructure which is required. Now let's look at the maintenance task in BCP. These are some of the key areas. You need to determine the ownership and the responsibility for maintaining the BCP as per the various strategy of the organization. You need to identify the maintenance triggers. Like I told earlier, whenever the major change happens at various aspects of the business process, it could be pertaining to the technology, the business process, the environment change, anything which impacts the business process, delivery of services, you need to consider, and there should be a maintenance trigger which says that there is a need to update the business continuity plan. And that could be pertaining to the organizational changes, operational changes, or structural changes, and these need to be communicated to the required staff. You also need to have a regular maintenance regime. Like I said, you need to ensure this is done, let's say, on an annual basis, which means annually you will review all the changes happened, and based on that you update. Let's look at a few more things. You also have a regular maintenance process, clearly assigning who is responsible for maintaining and updating the plan. And you implement version control procedures for the documentation, all the key aspects, so that you know what the plan which is being made available to the staff and this plan which is being made available is up to date. And if there is an off-site where the documentation has to be maintained pertaining to the BCP, this also has to be updated. Not only that, if there are certain critical staff who need to have access or need to have a copy of the plan as relevant to the operations, that updated plan should also be shared with the staff. So there is no sense in just updating the plan and keeping a copy in the head office or the main office or the IT department. The updated plan has to be shared with the staff, with the personnel, and also has to be stored offsite, which means wherever the existing plan is, when there is an update, that updated plan also has to be available in all the people with all the places. So when you're looking at a BCM arrangement, let's look at what is that you're going to verify. Verify that all the key products and services and the supporting critical activities which are required to provide these products and services are available. These have been identified and included in the BCM. You also need to look at the BCM policy and the strategies, framework, etc. to check whether actually meet the priorities and the requirements. You also need to look at the competence and the capabilities of the enterprise to ensure whether the BCM is fit for purpose, they have the right management personnel, they have the command structure, the controls, and the coordination to manage different types of incidents as they happen. And the BCM solution which has been adopted or implemented with the enterprise have to be effective, up to date, and fit for purpose to be able to bring the risk to the acceptable level. Let's look at a few more things we need to verify. You also need to test the maintenance and exercise. You also need to ensure that these are improvements as required are actually brought in based on the testing exercises which have been performed. You also need to remember that training and awareness is a continuous process and the staff need to be trained as required. The BCM plan, which is being updated, also has to have a clear aspect pertaining the roles and responsibilities, and this is communicated through proper training and also through communication. So you also have a change control mechanism in place. So what does the training cover? Let's have a quick overview of this. Training, as you know, is a tool to communicate to the stakeholders about the different aspects of the business continuity plan. The fundamental aspect is that it should work efficiently and effectively in a situation when it's required. So it also provides confidence to the stakeholders, especially the people who are involved, that in case there are emergency, the staff have been trained to handle emergencies. And the primary objective is to ensure that there is increase in resiliency, to ensure that the BCM implications are considered in decision making at all levels of the enterprise, so that they know what are the critical business operations and they're able to continue the business operation despite any disruptions. So you also look at minimizing the likelihood of the impact of the disruptions. This is one of the key aspects which have to be considered, and you communicate this to the staff as a part of the training. When you implement business continuity management, this is more of a culture. So when the staff should be informed clearly the criticality of having a BCM which meets the needs of the enterprise. So the leadership has to be provided by the senior personnel who emphasize and clearly communicate the importance of having a BCM. You assign the responsibilities as required to different teams. You conduct a training to raise the awareness about the importance of BCM and what are the roles and responsibilities. You also do a skills training so that specific skill sets as required are imparted, because in the case of a BCM, it's an extraordinary situation, so the regular staff may or may not be available. So you need to have people who are additionally trained in the relevant skill sets so that they can perform additional duties as required as per the BCM or the BCP. You also need to exercise or test the plans to confirm whether they actually work as envisaged. So these are some of the aspects pertaining to the training, awareness, and competency. You need to provide support. You need to remember these are difficult and challenging circumstances. You need to respond constructively. You need to adopt the leadership style to match the circumstances. And you need to promote a positive culture about the health, safety, environment, because this is one of the important aspects which help in mitigating the risk or which help in reducing the level of risk which can happen. We also recognize and reward the contribution by different colleagues or the employees in the organization. So when you have the right type of training, it also helps employees in ensuring that they take calculated risk because only by taking calculated risk they can get the benefits. So these are some more ideas pertaining to training awareness and consultancy. Training awareness and competency pertaining to the business continuity plan, and these are generic in nature. Let's have a quick recap of what we have discussed in part 3 of the presentation, which primarily focused on business continuity management. So BCM strategy process, we have discussed what are the aspects pertaining to the strategy, pertaining to the business continuity plan. We spent quite a lot of time on discussing how do you develop a business continuity plan. We also looked at the implementation aspects of a business continuity plan, especially from the perspective of business continuity management. And there are considerable discussion on how do you test a business continuity plan, what are the aspects that need to be tested, what are the different types of approach for testing, how do you set the test objectives, and based on which you perform different levels of tests. And when you perform the test, you need to ensure that the people are trained and the plan also is updated based on the results of the tests. And ultimately, the most important thing for any business continuity planning is to ensure that it's maintained on a regular basis. We also discussed what are the factors based on which you need to ensure that the BCM is continuously updated. Whether it's a DRP, whether it's a BCP or a BCM, you need to ensure that these are constantly or continuously tested and updated as required. Now, what the periodicity in which this has to be tested will be determined depending on the criticality or the nature of the business of the operations. And you need to have a training process because fundamentally it's all about the people. Now, if you remember, we talked about people, process, and technology, which is important to ensure that the BCM works as envisaged. So you have people, process, and technology, and primarily you can use technology for the purpose of running the processes, and these are operated by people. So when you look at a disaster, you need to look at all these factors. Fundamentally, technology used for running the business process. So you need to look at the different types of business process, look at the dependency on the resources in terms of technology, the process which are to be performed, and also look at the people who are required to train. So you need to train the people in the relevant process so that even in the event of a disaster, the business operations continued as required. With this overview, now you must have got a good idea of what is this BCM all about. Now we have said BCM is an overall macro framework which is used for ensuring that business is continued in the case of a disaster, and this is done at the enterprise level. Then you have BCP, which is business continuity planning, which is at the business process level, and then you have DRP, which is more at the technology level. We would have found in the presentation there could be certain repetitions which are there, and these repetitions certain times are by design and by default to communicate clearly what is the aspect you need to know about DRP. You know the distinction between DRP, BCP, and BCM. We also discussed what are the different phases or components of a business continuity plan or a business continuity management process. So with this, we'll now conclude the presentation. I hope you found this presentation useful. So thank you very much, and we look forward to meeting you again in the next presentation. Bye.